All right, good morning. So if you're in this session, you're here for Develop MN, and I'm going to give you kind of the how, why, and what, and why there's a Develop MN, and I guess maybe rather than tell you, I'd really like to know how you, as non-economic development planners, see this relevant to your work. So anyways, going back, we had 3 great funders who helped us pull this off. It was lots and lots of staff time, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank DEED, the Bush Foundation, and Blandin for helping to support this, because it was a very staff-intensive project. So why did we do a statewide economic development plan? And that's really what development is. It is a look at what is the commonalities and priorities for greater Minnesota. The RDC network, as you know, covers pretty much all of Minnesota outside the Twin Cities and the Rochester area and a couple other places. So why did we do this? And this goes back to 2012, which is crazy for me. When I saw that, I was like, you gotta be kidding me. But this first conversation was probably actually in Brainerd. Cheryl, am I right?
Yes, sir.
All right, so 2012, we were sitting around and we said, all right, what is an RDO network can we do to shape policy and kind of be the voice for greater Minnesota? And we were talking, and there was no real alignment. The Twin Cities and some of these other larger industries have one voice, and they're speaking for one voice when it comes to nonprofits, the legislature, these sorts of things. And we were saying, who speaks for greater Minnesota? And there was no really common voice. So that was really what we started with. And how can we identify shared resources and then maximize resources to go to those shared priorities? And that lack of alignment, we thought, really it led to us not necessarily having a place at the table when it came to setting policy in Minnesota. And so that's really where Develop MN came from. The other thing is we all do a SEDS. And it was like, okay, is there common elements of our SEDS that we can use as some sort of blanket document to serve greater Minnesota? So that's really kind of the why behind it. And so, as I said, first conversation began in 2012 here in Brainerd. It might even have been at Madden's. I don't remember quite where it was. No? Okay, good. But it was really about how do we establish this, this framework for MADO to speak as one voice on the issues that are most important to economic development in greater Minnesota. So process-wise, we looked at other states. There's a lot of other states, I think there's 4 or 5 that have done what's called a statewide SEDS. And so we looked at those, we asked them how their process worked, what didn't, what would they do differently. We brought in this guy here, who was great. His name's Brian Kelsey. He used to have a firm called Civic Analytics. I don't actually know what Brian's doing these days, but I couldn't recommend him more. He really came in and kind of said, okay, if you want to do this, this is what you got to do. This is what's going to be the best for the process. So having him kind of set our process together was really helpful. Then we sat down and looked at our SEDS. We started looking through all of our SEDS and saying, okay, what do we keep coming up with in all of our SEDS that are common to everybody? And it was things like talent. We all have human capital issues. We all have entrepreneurship initiatives. It's like, what are the common things in there? And we started pulling those out and looking at those and what do we have in common. Data review. I'm not a huge data guy, so this was like pulling teeth for me. We looked at every piece of data you could imagine, and we had a lot of help from Cameron Mock from DEED, and he's their demographer, and was able to go through every piece of data that everybody wanted, and we spent a lot of time. It was really helpful, because one of the things that we'll talk about here, and Brian Kelsey really encouraged us to do, was really have being data-driven and smart goal-oriented, so you can really say, this is what we want to do, and then being able to measure it, rather than say, we want to encourage and foster, and those great words that we all use in all of our planning documents. So then we kind of took all of that we did, the data, the SEDS, the best practices, and did your traditional SWOT analysis. Said, all right, where is greater Minnesota strong? Where are we weak? Where are opportunities? Where are our threats? We took all that, we put this SWOT together, and then the executive directors and economic development planners went out to all of our partners. And that included everything from our local businesses, nonprofits, major state foundations, major state organizations. This is what we're seeing. Does this make sense to you? And so then, they said, well, geez, I'm not seeing it that way, or yeah, I agree. And so we took that input and then sort of refined that SWOT. And that's ultimately what we used to start setting goals. But before we got there, I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the challenges here. And this was, it seems, oh, of course, Greater Minnesota, we've all got the same things in common. We're all hometown Minnesota, apple pie and all that sort of thing. But this was time consuming. This was a couple-year process where we were meeting in St. Cloud every 3 months, executive directors, economic development planners spending, not just like an hour, but a day going through this stuff. It was a long slog, and I think ultimately it was worth it, but it took a long time. And you're talking about a huge geography here. Minnesota is a large state, and I don't know if you know, but this place is a lot different than this place where I live. And everything from what it looks like, outside. I mean, the trees, the flora, and the fauna, to the industry. I heard Nicole mention in her presentation yesterday about ag being this driver for the Mankato area economy. Ag, important, but it's really not the thing in the Bemidji Headwaters area. And so we had to say, okay, what are the common things here? Because we're very different regions. Culture. I don't see Sean in here, or anyone from Northwest, at least not wearing a Northwest shirt. Oh, there. All right. I'll tell you what. People in Bemidji are different than people in Boston. I don't know why. There's like, I don't know if it's 100 years of chopping down trees versus 100 years of growing soybeans, but there's like these weird subtle differences. And so when you talk to people about these things, they'll say, hey, this is the most important thing, and then they'll be like, no, not really. And so you really had to kind of synthesize what are those really important things that everyone can agree on. And so that's really what we focused on, those few but important common themes. We ultimately took those and we kind of came up with 4 areas. And whether they're building blocks, cornerstones, we had called them cornerstones. But these are the 4 things we really thought that were the most important thing for Greater Minnesota moving forward. And it's human capital, your talent, your workforce, your entrepreneurs, those kind of human capital elements. Economic competitiveness, that's your traditional economic development, building business, growing wealth, those sorts of things. Foundational assets, which is basically a fancy word for infrastructure. And that includes everything from your traditional roads and sewer and water to broadband. We really looked forward and thought that was a foundational asset for future communities. And then community resources is really kind of that livability. How do you make communities that people want to live in, work in, and grow a family? So after all that, we as any good planning document, we had a great vision statement here. And as you can see, our vision was Greater Minnesota will have attractive communities with outstanding place-based amenities that encourage innovation, attract and retain talented workforce, and provide economic opportunity for all. So within each one of the cornerstones, we had kind of subcategories of what we thought were the most important things and the common elements of that. So in human capital, it was labor force and educational attainment. Economic competitiveness, innovation, entrepreneurship, small business growth. Community resources, and again, this is kind of our catch-all, so we had a lot of different ones here, and it's evolved. And that's one of the things I want to mention is we were convinced that if we just sort of declared victory and went home when we were done with this, that it wasn't going to be an effective process. So we've had some things that have risen to a more important place in this, and some things that have dropped out, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so community resources and tourism, arts and culture, I got tourism twice there because I was changing this PowerPoint from 3 years ago. Equity and inclusion, and natural resources. And then lastly, foundational assets, broadband, transportation, water and wastewater, and housing availability. So I mentioned earlier the SMART goal thing. Brian Kelsey, again, really hammered home, if you're going to do this, you've got to be able to measure what you're doing, because otherwise it's kind of a waste of time for everybody. And so if you're not familiar with kind of the SMART goals, it's, they've got to be specific, they've got to be measurable, they've got to be achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So as I go through kind of the goals that we came up with, you'll see that in theory they're all of these things. So I'm not going to go through every specific strategy here unless you really want, but I think that there's probably more important conversation after I get done about, how is this relevant to your work as a non-economic development lender? How can you incorporate this? Why should you care? But I just really want to run through here, at least on the goal side of things. So labor force. The thing that we saw across all regions is our labor force participation rates were low. And so we know that if you've got a region that's got enough employees, raise your hand. That's what I thought. So every one of our regions, we know that we have challenges with workforce. And so part of that workforce challenge is not only retaining and attracting talent to the region, but it's finding ways that people who aren't working right now, whether they've got disabilities, whether they're marginalized populations, for some reason they're not in the labor force. We have a strategy in there about taking people who are retired and finding ways to incorporate them back in the workforce, because we know that in order to grow our economy here over the next 20 years, we're going to have to find ways, creative ways, to fill those jobs. Educational attainment, while it's actually grown by leaps and bounds, in greater Minnesota you typically see less educational attainment than the Twin Cities. Now there's somebody smarter than me can tell you all the reasons why. I mean, everything from, I just paid $100,000 for this 4-year degree, and a job at the city starts at $25 an hour, and the one back home starts at 20. So I'm going to take the one at 25 in the Twin Cities versus those sorts of places attract educated people, but for whatever reason, greater Minnesota is lagged behind at every level: high school, trades, college. And so really increasing across all post-secondary education, everything from a welding certificate to a doctorate, we wanted to see an increase in that. Entrepreneurship and innovation. This is a little bit challenging for people. I still don't really even understand the matrix, but Stats America, who is actually a project out of the EDA Center of Indiana, right? Yep. Puts together what they call an innovation index, and they take 1 million different inputs and pick out how innovative you are as a region. You can put counties, region, that sort of thing. We took all the counties in our regions and put it in there, and one of the things we found is we're less innovative than metro area in the Twin Cities. So we wanted to increase that and be known as an innovative place. So small business, as you'll hear over the next year with the elections coming up, small business, it's the bedrock of all of our communities, right? So we know that we wanted to make sure that small businesses were thriving in rural Minnesota or greater Minnesota. I'm going to use those all interchangeably. I mean the same thing. Even though I know Bemidji and Duluth and Brainerd aren't exactly rural, but we'll call them that for today. So we wanted to increase business establishments and increase gross sales. Tourism. So one of the things that almost every region has is a tourism economy. It looks really different. There are very different tourism amenities in, say, northern Minnesota versus southern Minnesota, but it's important to all of our communities. So not only from an economic development and people dropping dollars, but in employment. So we saw tourism as an important part, and we saw the best way of measuring that was an increase in visitor spending. Arts and culture, again, whether it's an actual, wealth creator or a way of making our communities more livable and more attracting and retaining talent, we saw arts and culture as an important part of making greater Minnesota a better place to live. So again, looking back, we had probably 10 different metrics here and ultimately decided the best way we could sort of measure this and be accountable to our goals was just tracking employment. So we wanted to increase employment by 5% in arts and culture. This is really new. This is I would say this is kind of a to be determined. We went out and shared this, and last spring we went to a conference that was losing the name of it, but
held by Growth and Justice. It was Thriving by Design Blueprint.
Yeah, the Thriving by Design process by Growth and Justice, and we had a couple executive directors say, hey, look what we're doing. We're kind of on the same page, one Minnesota, and here's what we came up with. And, there's the response is immediately like, I really think you're missing something on the diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then later today, Dawn will talk a little bit about what they're doing in Region 5 and kind of maybe some things that we can bring back. But, as greater Minnesota moves forward, we're going to have to change the way we do inclusion and equity. And again, that's one of those things that looks very different. In my region, a quarter of the population is Native American. And if you've heard anything about, kind of the statistics about Native Americans, it's high unemployment, high poverty, health disparities, those sorts of things. In some other regions, it's New Americans. It's, we've got a Somali population or, a Latino population, that sort of thing. And so our initial response was, well, the diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's a value that's interwoven into the whole document. The input we received was, you need to be really intentional about that and kind of say it, and so the last 9 months since that time, we've been kind of thinking about, okay, equity, inclusion, how do you really think about that as rather than a philosophy or a value, but an actual goal? And so one of the ways you can measure that is an index basically that measures inequality or income inequality. 0 would be no income inequality, and then obviously the higher you go, the more income inequality. So right now, it's at 0.45. We want to move that as close to 0 as possible. And the strategies, as I said, are a work in progress. So we'll kind of see those evolve as the planners get together and decide, what the best way to move that needle is. Natural resources. Huge challenges with the natural resources because you're talking about very different natural resources. Is it bluffs and rivers? Is it North Shore landscape? Is it agriculture in the West? Everyone's natural resources are a little bit different, but the things we kind of found in common were climate change is going to be a challenge for us, and invasive species. Those are the things that everyone can kind of say, these are the things that we're worried about. So we wanted to measure sort of the spread of invasive species, how can we reduce that, how can we mitigate that, and then by carbon footprint, increasing the kilowatts of renewable energy. As Cheryl said today, there's still a few people who are a little scared about that, think that it's out to get them. But we know not only will that help protect our climate, but it's also going to create jobs in Greater Minnesota. So, foundational excellence, as I mentioned, the one thing I think that we had no real complaints about across the group was everybody said we need better broadband accessibility in Greater Minnesota. That was the only thing. I don't think there was one question about, is this really the most important thing? And this was far and away the most agreeable thing. And so, again, this is another goal that's changed as between the first iteration of the document and now kind of responding to what the latest and greatest on sort of internet speeds and these sorts of things. So, as of right now, I think it started at 20 down and 5 up was our 2012 iteration of this, and obviously that changes, and so we're responding to that, and we've updated that to 100 down and 20 up. I won't be able to tell you what this is, so I really hope a transportation planner is in here and can tell me what this is, because this is another one that we evolved, and we had a bunch of what I guess would say were kind of clunky and cumbersome measurements of transportation, but we know there's roads failing, our transit systems, if we're doing RTCC work, our transit systems are challenging in Greater Minnesota. We know we have transportation issues, but you get back to that. Well, how do you measure it? Because you can't just measure like, oh, that road got built in, Sauk Center, And so somebody smarter than me, John Winkler and some other folks put together this.
It's a reliability
Thank you.
index. So I can't give you the specifics, but what it does is they measure how reliable. If it takes you 4 hours to get from Moorhead to the metro, is that the same 4 hours? And this measure covers annually, so it's adjusted for weather, Minnesota weather. And so we are measuring in general that how long you say it's going to take you, it actually takes you that long. Like you didn't hit a pothole, or you didn't have to be routed onto a crappy road, and you didn't have to get stuck behind a tractor or slow moving. Yeah, it's a really interesting measure, but as I said, as Ryan said, it's hard to describe. But it exists, yay.
Thank you so much. As I said, somebody smarter than me can explain it. Again, that was an ongoing challenge as we, it's pretty easy to identify a challenge or an opportunity, but to sort of come up with a measurement for it, that was one of the challenges that we kind of banged our head with on a lot of these, another one that's coming, a couple of these ones were really difficult. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, we need more labor force participation. It's another thing to say, we need better housing. What's better housing?
Excuse me for a second, do you know what it is now? It says reduce it to 1.4 or more, what is it at now? Do we have a-
1.5 or 1.6, something like that.
Also, it's not a lot different.
Yeah, one of the things we did is, well, in a perfect world, like, hey, labor force participation rate would be 80%. We also recognize it's not going to go from 68% to 80 overnight, and so, that's kind of the A and the SMART. We try to set both ambitious but achievable. Because if we're sitting here 5 years from now and go, oh, geez, we only raised the labor force participation rate 3%, we did a terrible job. In reality, that's a monumental change. So.
Right, I was just curious where it is, because if you drive in other states, I think our roads are really good up here. And so I was curious what we are, how far we are from the goal.
And Brian talked about that too. It's going to give us a measure to compare state to state and region to region.
You just brought up an interesting point. Some of the feedback we got, we had, in an earlier iteration of this, we had like a social capital kind of like volunteerism involvement, and one of the things we were saying is, oh, we already lead the nation. Like, voter turnout, volunteer, these are the things we already sort of are leading the way. And it's like, if we're already at the top of the heap, are these things that, they're super important, but do they rise to the level of being, a priority in this document and something? So there's things like, so just that whole idea of where we're at as a state, that was part of the planning process too. We're thinking about our neighbors and region as well. So wastewater infrastructure, again, this is another one that was really challenging because every community has different needs. There's some communities that are growing really fast and need to invest in infrastructure to respond to this. There are some that are losing population, and they need to find a way to maintain the existing infrastructure. So what we ultimately came up with was reducing the gap in funding available and the actual cost to $100 million by 2030. Right now, I think there's like a $350 million gap between funds available and actual wastewater needs. So that was how we came up with that one. Housing. This was one that we, again, it's challenging because there's a lot of communities that are saying, we've got a 20% vacancy rate, and we need to figure out how to take down some of these dilapidated housing and save the ones that are valuable. There's other places like Thief River Falls that if you built 2 apartment buildings next week, they'd be full. And so how across that great difference, can we have a common goal and sort of a common measurement? And what we ended up coming up with was, in both the communities that need to sort of preserve and reduce the housing stock and those that need to increase, if we're lowering the cost burden, that's a pretty good indicator that we're doing good work in the housing. So we ultimately chose that reducing the cost burden from 25 to 23% was the best way of doing that. So, so what? Implementation. We just spent all this time doing this. What does this look like? How are we actually going to achieve this? And it's complicated. It really is. The primary purpose of this is we're creating alignment at NATO, and then using that alignment at NATO to then influence the organizations that are in our sphere. And we can go out to the Blandons, the Bushes, the Corn Growers Association, these sort of things, and say, here's what we're seeing are the absolute most important things going on in Greater Minnesota. And how can we work together on a local level on projects that are going to move these goals? And so that's kind of the strategic document, and that's what it was for. Our SEDS now look like this and respond to this. It's in the same format. We're using the same 4 cornerstones. We're all using SMART goals. So I can pick up the SEDS from Arrowhead and say, all right, what's Josh working on? What are the things that are important to him? And do I have the same things going on? We're very similar regions. We work in a lot of timber industry, and so I can look at his and go, oh, geez, maybe we could work together on this and that sort of thing. So that's really the primary purpose of this. And our hope is, as this process evolves and as we look into future opportunities, we can find ways to collaborate on projects both across NATO, but also bringing in other organizations that we traditionally don't work with, that might not know who we are, and saying, hey, we've got a common interest in, childcare. How do we make this happen in our region? And so that's really kind of where we're going from an implementation standpoint, is both at a very local project-based level, because if I'm doing this project on housing and, Waseca, it's ultimately going to, help achieve this goal, versus, how can we work together on, advocating for different child care policy at the state level. And how we're going to all measure that is, and I'll turn it over here. Are we about ready? I want to make sure.
Hey Ryan, real quick, can you talk about how we have the other partners, so the non-RDO areas are covered?
Yeah, so we, within the process, we invited, and I'm going to be remiss if I don't remember all their actual organizations' names, but as you know, we've kind of, we've always called it the hole in the donut problem, with like St. Cloud, Rochester, these areas that aren't served by an RDC, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't just going ahead without actual representation and input from them. So within the process, we reached out to, is it SWIFT?
Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation.
Southern Minnesota,
They're
not
looking for
SWIFT.
these, yeah.
So the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation, and there is an organization in St. Cloud right now that's kind of a proto-RDC. I don't exactly know how they're organized. I don't think it's an RDO, but they're doing a lot of the same things. They're doing a SEDS, they're doing some of the, they applied to be an EDD. And throughout the process, we had their input, and they had seats at the table just so their voices were heard and those regions were being represented. Thanks, Nicole. So leading into, we're going to bring in a partner of ours who's helping us develop a dashboard. And it comes back to, okay, if you're going to say these things are important, you need to track them and you need to measure them. And so we're bringing in a partner right now who's going to share a little bit about a dashboard that's being created that really actually outlines, how do we track these things, how do we measure them, how do you find all this information in one place rather than having to go and census.gov and Minnesota DEL online. How do you find these things in one place? So as soon as he's ready, I will turn it over to our.
Are you with us?
He said he had joined and he was hearing, I assume, Ryan talking.
Okay, John, I see you talking, but I can't hear you, so we're gonna adjust some things and see if we can get you on.
And it should be, his name's Dave.
Dave? Oh, sorry.
So,
Can I, Christian, quick explain who Dave is, and just give a little context while
Yeah.
we're waiting for technology to buy some time here?
thanks. I was actually just, as I said, here you go, Christian. And then we'll do, I got some questions at the end for you, and I'll also take questions after Dave's done, but we're going to try to transition to him. I'll let Christian in.
Sorry, Christian.
So our friend Dave Cruz, he works for Auto Media Group in Mankato. He's a web developer and is also a data guy, teaches at multiple universities, data mining and that kind of stuff in the Mankato area. And Dave has been tasked by Mado to develop this interactive dashboard. And he's kind of doing it over 3 phases. He's completed 2 of them, which is basically gathering all the data and creating a platform that's kind of user-friendly. The 3rd phase will be eventually kind of similar to Compass in terms of including historic data so it can be used by planners. But these first 2 phases is really for the non-planners to be able to utilize the data where you can say, when they get a phone call, let's say, from a commissioner, and they say, how are we doing with these goals? Where are we? What are the goals? They can click there. The idea is also that each website, so for us, rnbc.org, will have a direct link to this platform. And Dave has been working on this for, that's clearly not Dave, for, I would say, 2 or 3 months now.
Well, as is the tradition, technology issues.
And while we're waiting, we could mention mention that, a special thanks to Grow from Justice, because they were able to help us get funding from the McKnight Foundation to be able to help fund this project, and so this is something where they came in as a partner as well.
All right, while we wait for the technology, I was gonna have them at the end, but any kind of questions about the process of development, and then how it was developed, maybe something on some of the specific goals, anything like that?
On your rural broadband, are you gonna look at maybe also cell phone coverage, 5G, 4G? Because I know in transportation, as we look for apps and automatic vehicle connections, that's coming up with big issues.
That's actually a great question, and I've heard from people who have said that, especially that last mile, the cost-effective solution basically for it is going to be that 4G, 5G. You're never going to have necessarily fiber to the home, but if you can use like a very like a high-speed like 5G cell phone coverage, that might be the opportunity. So we don't specifically have that mentioned, but that's really good, and I will take that into our next planners meeting, because one of the things we do at every quarterly, the economic development planners get together every quarter, and one of the things that's just a standing thing on our agenda is development advocates. And it's like, have you heard anything that necessitates some change here? Are you thinking about anything? So I appreciate that. Other questions about the process or the existing document?
Is it just volume? What's that? Is it just volume that's the issue?
If he can show us the dashboard, we could put the microphone by someone's cell phone if we have to get kind of creative here.
He could hear us and then he said he went away.
Is the goal to be able to use this measurement tool year over year so that we can identify growth and use it with the legislature to leverage?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is. The idea is that, and that's why we wanted to create the dashboard rather than just kind of having this housed in a document, is that way we can sort of keep looking back at this on a year-by-year basis, adjusting our strategies. You know, if there's something that's showing either a real concern or a real opportunity, being able to, like you said, share that with the legislative, committee or, a trade organization or something like that. So yeah, we wanted to produce a living document that's going to continue to evolve as Minnesota evolves.
Do you work with other partners to see what they're doing that's kind of working on the same issues, like transportation stuff?
Yeah, our process of involving different partners is one of the great things in the RDO network, as you mentioned. We all have MnDOT contracts, and so we work closely with MnDOT, and so we're able to engage with our both in the office, like you and me. I can walk down the hall and say, Brian, what do I need to know about transit? But we also have that relationship with MnDOT, so we can kind of also look at those 10,000-foot level views. Yeah, my apologies, but like I said, it wouldn't be right if there wasn't at least one issue with technology. Here's a question I'd be interested. Those of you who weren't involved in the process of development, what does it mean for the work you do? Whether you're a transportation planner or you're a financial officer or have another role.
So we're in the Aging Network,
Okay.
okay? And I know there's only one other RDO that has Aging connected with them again. But like I think of like when you're talking about childcare in our area, I'm from Park Rapids, so our area, we have tons of grandparents raising grandchildren. So that puts a whole new spin on child daycare.
Yes, it does.
As we have seniors working as they're older, they're working longer. And so it puts them in, so I'm just wondering if those types of things, if anyone's being brought in to look at from any of the AAAs across the state.
So our primary influence was, as you said, you are the only area aging that's involved in the RDO network. And so,
Arrowhead also.
Oh, Arrowhead. Okay. And yeah, I think those are the things we're looking at. I mean, as we looked at the data when we kind of did that data dive, we were seeing, hey, there's older populations, both from the fact that our regions are aging. You said Park Rapids. I'm from Park Rapids, actually, originally. That's my hometown.
Perfect example of tourism, and like, I'm not from there originally, but when I moved there 9 years ago, my first observation was Park Rapids is the Florida of Minnesota. Everyone comes there to retire.
That's funny, I've heard somebody else mention that too. So not only are the existing populations aging in some of those regions, but we're importing
Right.
retirees, which is kind of skewing those things. So when we go, okay, when you, like, whether it's anything from childcare and our grandparents raising child, because we know with the issues with sort of disease of despair, addiction, these sorts of things, we are seeing more sort of that thing. Beltrami County, where I work in, is frankly about to be bankrupt because of the child placement system. And so those issues are on our mind and sort of woven into those because the level of importance ebbs and flows across the region. It didn't specifically hit, a thing, but strategies, at least, on the ground for me, are looking at things like that.
Are you looking at, like, what states are we competing with? Are there certain states you're trying to measure against more than others, like Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota?
That's a really good question.
I don't think we're measuring against other states as much as we're measuring against the SMART goals of within our own state. And so we're setting our own stretch measures based upon where we want to be versus comparing it to other states. But we did compare initially to Florida, Texas, other areas where we're seeing a lot of migration, and there is migration to Minnesota as a result of quality of water and healthcare. So we were trying to compare against other states that had statewide sets, but we did not, we haven't set the dashboard to other states, if that's your question.
I would add to the dashboard, hopefully we'll see it, but we can compare, we'll be able to compare region to region for Greater Minnesota as well as against the metro, and then down to county level. So you can take any of your counties and compare it to any of the other 86 in that regard.
You mentioned something earlier.
He's on the phone, so whenever we wanna.
Put it in.
I'll tell you, let's turn it over to Dave here. I think we've got a solution to our tech issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and he's going to talk a little bit about the dashboard and how we can, as Nicole said, kind of make sure we're tracking both at county, region, and state level.
All right, Dave, you're good to go.
Fantastic. Good morning, friends of me. Can you hear me now?
Not really.
Your phone turned on.
You tell me you can hear me all right. I'll just
That's good.
blathering on for a minute, and as soon as I sound good, you just let me know, and then I'll jump into the hard ones.
You're sounding pretty good, Dave.
Oh, good. Good. Fantastic. Well, good morning again, friends of me. A pleasure to join you. I'm joining you from down in Mankato. So I haven't been able to hear you much so far. I'm Dave Cruz, and there's me live via satellite. And we're building the process of what we're running together for this event. Now, are you guys able to see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, for those of you who have not seen Jurassic Park, that would be Dennis Nedry, myself. Like my incomparable lane night. I'm Dave Cruz. I've been building web applications for over 20 years, and I really enjoy my time with you guys working on this project. And so what I wanted to do is just give you an idea of what we're building, how we're going to find a useful, and going to bring you to the process that we've got through so far. Nicole and Corey and Christian and I started talking several months ago, or a few months ago, and they asked me the question, can we add a goals dashboard to our website? Now first, to our Meta website. Okay, yeah, there's a number of ways we can do that, but then can we also, it'd be really nice to be able to add it to, let's say, a regional website, something like, here in my area, Region 9, my home region. documents or handouts or pages and inserted into something that is handed out to shareholders in the meeting, whatever the case might be. And just to back this point up, I've shown this by this chart which shows how cool presentations are. Charts. Anyway, the problem with data is data can be very difficult. You know, it's very spread out. Here in Minnesota, we've got data about placement in one place. We have data about housing somewhere else. We've got deed and income places to find data. For one individual in one part of the state, it's sort of a process that has to be repeated over and over again, going and finding data that's useful in planning, data that's useful in sharing ideas and sharing the need for certain plans or showing measurable progress towards certain goals. So it's spread out. It's hard to get. Sometimes to get good data, you need to have someone at one of these organizations that has the data do a special report for you or help you get it. And the data you can get can also be sometimes overly complex for a lot of use cases. It requires filtering, requires some sort of collation or data crunching. And we have multiple people doing the same process over and again. That's very inefficient. And so what we wanted to do is come up with a little utility that would solve some of these problems. And so we're going to do a wish list of what we would want this dashboard utility to do. So we wanted a dashboard that would, first of all, provide some key goal metrics, kind of like a scoreboard that would show in simple terms and big numbers how state of Minnesota as regions or statewide or in certain counties, how is looking up to goals set through these SMART goals. And we want to be able to look at this data through the scope of a region or a county and be able to even put that on multiple websites without a whole lot of overhead, without a lot of recursing code or programming, but to be able to embed a small bit of code that would bring this in and allow a website to show, right? So the county website have use some of this utility the same way a region or a meta website would. We want to be able to show historical data, changes. We want to be able to provide one-stop access to some of the data itself so that users could even download and get access to that data that's useful. So you can find it all in one place without sending people all over. And we want to be able to have it be interactive so folks can click in and learn more information about the SMART goals and also see where they get some of the deeper data as well as where the data comes from so you can cite sources and things like that. So we came up with was a set of called wishes right now, a wish list, to be able to do all these things to really provide something that's useful both to EDOs, planners, as well as useful to businesses who might be looking at viable places to expand or grow, something that's useful to community leaders, something that can be useful to legislators. And so what we come up with is this question: where do you start? So what can we build that would be of use? That would be a starting point, knowing that it could be a big project to be able to satisfy all those goals. And so what we wanted to do is start with something like phase one that would give us a process by which we would gather data, have a little system that would manage data, be very flexible so we could add data to it and go on it and change it, and then push that data out so it could be consumed. And so we started on what we're going to call phase one, which is a utility that's going to manage data. And it's not going to do everything that we want on our wish list in phase one, but when we roll out this first version of this widget, it will allow you you to see the big numbers and allow you to see the goals. It'll be driven by live data and can be distributed across websites. So what we did is we looked at a couple of websites as well to get kind of a goal where we wanted to go. One of which was Florida Scorecard. Hold on. You guys still see my screen okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. So we started looking at a Florida Scorecard, and we're big fans of what they've done, and it's a neat website that shows this dashboard level view, some real like scorecard or scoreboard style big numbers that show how they're doing by certain metrics. And they also have the ability here to look at data by county and click and see historical data. So really neat things. And so we're using this as one of our inspirations. There was a couple others that Nicole and Corey and Christian pulled out that they thought were useful starting points as far as inspiration goes. And so this kind of illustrates where we would like to go, what we would like to build. What we're working on today is a simplified version of this that gives us that whole process. We wanted to build something that starts the whole process end to end and shows not only a useful product from day one when we launched this, but also something that can be added on to and expanded and grown with additional historical data, future data, more metrics, more backing data, that shows and proves the numbers shown here. So, what we're working on today is something that looks like this. This is filling my whole screen, but this is just a demonstration of the widget and what it could look like, what it will look like when it's embedded in the website. And I ask you to look at this to kind of squint your eyes a little bit, and you might read through some of these things and say, well, that number can't be right, or that goal should be worded differently. And that's okay right now. We're still importing data in and refining and updating the wording of these goals and exactly where they belong. So that's all changing as we go.
Can you make your screen a little bit larger?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you make your screen a little bit larger? Make it full screen?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Like this?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Now, you see here, it's filling my whole screen. This is also meant to be able to fit within the confines of different websites and the content areas. But like I said, let's look at this and know that some of these, the wording here and some of the numbers are not final, but they're being inputted into the system now. So you repeat that, Craig?
Would you be able to zoom in on, for instance, like the new business growth so that we would be able to see that better?
Absolutely. Is that better?
Is that better? Can you go in just a little bit more?
Sure.
That's good, Dave.
Dave, Ryan Zemmick here. One of the earlier questions was about kind of this being a living document and measurement. Can you talk about the updating process and how do you make sure that these, as you said in your introduction, data changes constantly? Can you talk a little bit about the ability for a tool like this to be updated constantly?
Sure. So the back-end tool that we're building allows for every little bit, every little piece of metric data to be edited individually. We also have the ability to take a spreadsheet or something like that and work the whole thing in. So we create lots of records at once. What that means is this number 224, as it applies to, in this case, statewide. If that number should be 223, and we need to make that change, it will be a matter of going to the management application, which sits on its own website. It's currently out running on a server, a big data warehouse, data center, and we plug into that, and we go into economic competitiveness, new business growth for the state of Minnesota, and change that number to 223. And then every time someone loads this, it will go back behind the scenes. So if someone loads a Meta website, for instance, this little vendor on Sweden, next thing that'll happen is this little bit of code in the background runs over to that website and says, hey, give me all the latest data for the state of Minnesota statewide. And that data comes back, and all those numbers are populated. So it would be a very good change. Now, not only the numbers, but also, let's say, the name new business growth, or the goal, maintain and then increase in business establishments. Say we want to take that. That also applies for the wording. So we can change the text of that goal. We can change that new business filings right beneath number 224 for this metric. This goal. If we want to change any of that wording, again, you go on to our management website, and tool that lives on its own website. We make the changes to the text, changes to the numbers, and they will show up next time someone loads this.
Other questions for Dave about this application? Christian? Probably the best way.
Yeah.
Hi Dave, you can probably hear who this is.
Yes, how are you?
No, I'm very well. It's odd talking to you without a pizza bagel in my hand, but
This is very odd.
yeah, it is. You started to allude to it, but I have two questions for you, Dave, which I think will be helpful. If you talk about, for instance, the labor shortage, you have changed a little bit of the language to make it more user-friendly for the person who's not a planner. I hope you know what I'm talking about. Remember, the goal was to reduce the labor shortage to 30%. Can you address that one? And second, you have some idea after digging into some of this data about certain categories such as equity and inclusion, where that actually belongs?
Sure. Both excellent questions, Christian. So looking at this data and building this little tool, I was reading across it and noticing that because we're measuring things, sometimes from we want to reduce this number standpoint, and sometimes I want to increase this number standpoint. As you're scanning across, I was having difficulty figuring out, okay, is higher better or is higher worse in this situation, right? Do I want to, let's say the number is 51%. Does that those calculations a little quicker and easier rather than let's say, well, wait, should we go trying to go down here or trying to go up? And it also just has a fun, kind of framing everything in a positive mindset, which is the way I like to think. So maybe that's my own foible. But that was the goal. Christian, I'm sorry, what was your second question?
The second question, Dave, was as you were looking at this as a data analytics person and digging into the data, you were making a comment about equity and inclusion and where that really should belong.
Sure. So looking at some of these, the more I looked into it, looking like community resources, for instance, you know, with visitor spending or arts and culture, you know, here we're measuring things that I would say maybe are economic measurements versus a community resource. It sits awkwardly with something like equity and inclusion and invasive species in water. And so, you know, as I looked at this, well, maybe this is excuse me, something that could require a little bit more thought as we go through, and how can we better bring these and better communicate how they are related to each other, better communicate what we're getting at. And so from a back-end standpoint, what I've done is made this very flexible as well. So if we ever wanted to take, for instance, visitor spending, which is currently under community resources, if we want to, wherever we show this dashboard, if we now want to include visitor spending up under, say, economic competitiveness, that again would be a few clicks in the back-end system, and we can make that move. And next time someone loads this little thing on the website, it would be moved into that other area. So because of that, looking at that, we'll see not only, you know, maybe some areas where we could dig a little deeper and find a better way to communicate these goals. Also seeing in the past couple of months, you know, the fantastic work of all the ones that are part of putting this together. It means there's a lot of changes, a lot of ongoing process, a lot of ongoing work to settle how we communicate these goals. And so to accommodate that, try to build this system to be as flexible as I can.
To that point, Dave, and maybe for the group, a couple of those things that Dave mentioned there about, well, visitor spending, it's under community resources, that's a little odd. It kind of comes back to, it's really sometimes hard to quantify some of the things we do. So, yeah, tourism as an economic driver maybe makes more sense under economic competitiveness, and you know, you've got employment in arts and culture. Those kind of came out of two separate conversations. We know creative placemaking is a really important part of creating vibrant communities in greater Minnesota, reinventing downtowns, these sorts of things. But how do you measure creative placemaking? There's kind of that truth versus fact issue there, and so we sort of worked backwards and said, okay, if there's more artists employed in greater Minnesota, is that a leading indicator that, you know, we're investing in things like creative placemaking, public art, these sorts of things. So while they sometimes have odd, it's sort of somebody looking from the south side, they might have sort of seem in odd spaces. It's because often we couldn't find a better place to put it and a better measurement. But we wanted to, again, come back to the thing, we wanted to quantify everything that we had in so we could track it.
Well, that makes great sense.
Dave, I might add to the audience here that what Dave has done here is not trying to undermine the work that the working group for Development Man has done. He has built it in such a way that it can change very easily. We've been fortunate to see kind of what's behind it, and I don't understand that at all. But Dave is very patient, and he explains, and he shows me all this cool stuff. But if the working group decides that, for instance, equity and inclusion is an economic competitiveness issue, it's minor changes at his end to change it around. So that's one of the useful elements of the way that Dave is building it.
questions for myself or Dave here? We got a few minutes left.
Extend our gratitude from NATO to Dave, please.
Dave, just on behalf of the whole group, we want to thank you for joining us and working through our tech issues. You know, unfortunately, sometimes that's just how things work out. But thank you so much for the work you've done in joining us this morning. I don't think there's any more questions for you, so, oh, there's one more question. Christian's got one more here for you.
I'm just dying to talk to you, Dave. One thing, no. I'm faking it up here too. Just one thing that I think would be helpful for those who are non-economic development planners in the room is from a marketing, you know, your organization is affiliated with a marketing organization. What's your vision in terms of how this can be utilized to drive traffic to Mato's website by, you know, legislatures or regional websites? Where do you see the benefit from a marketing standpoint?
Well, good question. So I will answer that in kind of two parts. Let's think both short-term and long-term. Short-term, this provides, from a marketing standpoint, that really nice visualization of a lot of data, right? Data is often, you know, a large iceberg, and the part of it that's attractive and interesting to most people is that tip of the iceberg on top. And so this allows you to really digest that tip of the iceberg. It also allows you to say, you know, hey, go out and look at our Mato website, or go look at our county website and see some of these key metrics. And they can be quickly and easily met and quickly and easily assessed. And so from a quick marketing standpoint, that's one of the early goals, to be able to simply provide this in an updated fashion with the latest data on the website and say, go refer to that. The other more long-term goal with this, what we're hoping that we can accomplish in the next, let's say, phase 2 and maybe phase 3, is to add to this more historical data, more depth to background understanding of what these goals mean, and perhaps what they could mean to your, say, business or to your, for your community leaders or things like that. And oftentimes, if you're going to go and talk with a potential business, or if you're going to talk with a legislator, or if you're going to talk with another community leader in a region, well, you want to go equipped with information and data. So what I'd like to be able to do is make it so that you could pull up one of these, let's say, new business growth, and not just see the number 224, but actually quickly access and get the data, the historical data, or maybe more data about this. And so long-term vision and goal for this project is not just to provide these big numbers in green, because they're great for quickly digesting and really showing off, hey, look, we're doing toward these goals, but also to give the tools necessary in kind of a one-stop shop that you might use if you're going out to communicate with those people. So we kind of want to get from the process of, okay, I want to plan, or I want to discuss this with someone. Now, where do I need to go to get the data that's relevant? Where do I need to go to deep? Do I need to go to an Encompass? Or is there someone that works in this organization that could run this report? I want to get up to that as much as possible. And over time, make this the place that you would go and find that data.
Dave, this is Cheryl Hills from Region 5, and I love the work you've done here. Although my eyes can't read your white small text very well, just a side note, because I'm old. But I love the fact to be able to go back and get some of that historical data to have a baseline and understand a little bit more and to explain that story. And in my world of being able to, of euphoria, of dashboards, it would be that we could also give local context to the data. So if I'm pulling this for a region, and I have, I'm not necessarily meeting that goal, or we're over-excelling in it, there's some local context around access to childcare, or any of these goals that are important. So to be able to put some narrative behind that, we can certainly do that on our own websites for phase 1, but as we look at phase 2, it would be really great to be able to give some information behind those numbers so that people can see either why or what's coming down the pipe in terms of strategies to address that goal and where it is today. So that's a phase 2 sort of parking lot item to think about. And is that something you guys have already talked about?
Yes, this is, you're saying my tune, this is great. Yeah, that's where we want to go. So it's definitely on the roadmap of what we'd like future phases to include this. Not just data, but also, the context, the full understanding. And being able to take this to, and be able to say, okay, now show me this at my more local level, if that's my county or whatever it needs to be. So yeah, that's certainly in the realm of what the future iteration could hold.
You know, one place to start, Dave and Cheryl, is within the document, and I don't think I expressed this just as in the interest of time, is each one of these cornerstones and objectives has a call to action on it, where we, as planners, sort of outline why we think this is important and why this is should be a priority to Greater Minnesota. So that might be sort of a phase 1 thing where you could click on this and it's, hey, it's labor force participation rate, and then you click on it and it says, here's why we've identified this as, one of the most important priorities.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, to bring that up, I forgot to mention, idea here for phase 1 is learn more. We'll always point back to Mato's website, to a page on Mato's website about this particular goal, business growth, or in this case, if I click on learn more, it would be for the business growth sales. With all the information, like we've gotten the paper document about the goals. Yep.
Last questions for Dave? All right, well, Dave, thank you again so much on behalf of Mato and the work you've done. Have a really great day, and we'll let you go here.
Thanks very much. For the pleasure to join you guys. I wish you a very wonderful conference and a safe drive home.
Great, thanks, Dave.
All right, with that, we're about wrapped up. I guess what I would leave you with is whether you're a general community development planner, you're a transportation planner, you work in aging, you're in administration and finance. While it's an economic development document, DevelopMN is really, it includes all phases of the work we do at Mato. And look for opportunities to work sort of, across functional areas within your office, but also think about, I know the economic development planners have quarterly meetings. I know transportation planners have quarterly meetings, and the finance people have quarterly meetings. If there's opportunities to work across functional areas in your office or across Mato regions, I think that's kind of the next phase where we're at, is how can we work collaboratively across projects. Yeah, Christian.
I had 2 Diet Cokes, I feel a need to talk with. When we met in Little Force last January, executive directors, some planners, we were talking about actually creating an annual PDF that would summarize this. And since Dave is off the phone now and doesn't know this, he's doing this within the financial parameters of what that one PDF would cost. So it's a pretty good investment from, not speaking for Mato, but in my eyes, this is something that really can live on from year to year rather than to be a one-time thing. Here's a PDF, great, go and share it with your elected officials. Okay.
All right, with that, we'll let you get going. I got about a half-hour break, and it looks like 11 o'clock. There's another session, so go take a walk, check out, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
I have